again. I'm going to do a munch and learn today. It's a little bit longer than my 1 minute munchies, probably about 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes. The topic is something I've labeled beyond the application. It's rethinking how we buy our IT. And I just think it's about time, we really looked at this in a little bit of detail, just to raise some awareness of some different ways of thinking about procuring our IT for our organization. Recently I've been on a few trips with some customers, and I was surprised to see how they were looking at sending out requests for information, requests for quotes, requests for pricing. And I just wanted to address that in terms of it sounds a little bit antiquated, and let me go into why. So just a quick safe harbor statement. So what will you take away from this little munch and learn? Well, the evolution of the technology stack has gone to a whole different level in terms of abstracting the software layer from the compute layer. And we really got to look at, do we continue with the status quo in terms of what we and how we buy, or is there a different way to think about our buying patterns? One-stop shops. They are positive in one sense, but if you're moving towards a microservices platform and you're looking to abstract yourself at the software layer in terms of software-defined computing, then maybe one-stop shops are not necessarily the most cost-effective way to go forward. Now, I do want to caveat that one-stop shops for all your technology in terms of converged infrastructure, are good. It de-risks, it's all integrated, it's pre-working. But maybe the future holds something different, and that's what we're going to briefly talk about today. And if we are moving towards a different future, then should we be looking at how we make our vendor selections differently? And that's something that's interesting. So let's go back in time a little bit and just summarize the last 3 decades in terms of generically what has the integrated or the IT stack looked like. So if we look at, going into the 80s, and on the screen here you can see 3 infrastructures here, Solaris based, AIX based, HPUX based, and they have proprietary hardware to go with it. What we found with these types of infrastructures is that generally, because of the way the stack was integrated, we were locked in. But is that necessarily a bad thing? Maybe at the time it was okay. So that's back in the 80s. Then we go into the 90s and we started to see, people moving away from proprietary hardware and multiple different operating systems, and 2 basic choices appeared in the marketplace. One was Windows, and then it was Linux, and everybody sort of standardized on a x86 processor platform. But you were still locked into a solution set, less proprietary. You've sort of started the journey of abstracting away from proprietary technologies by having a common platform. So moving a little bit more forward into the 2000s, and really you saw the concept of virtualization appear, where you started to get the idea that you're actually abstracting the operating system through a hypervisor away from the hardware. So all of a sudden it didn't matter anymore what hardware you had, as long as you had the virtualization layer. So that's the last 3 decades of, I guess, a generalized view of how architecture has evolved, as an integrated stack. But where are we today? Things have changed, and with the evolution of microservices coming to bear through cloud native tools, what you got to look at is where are organizations taking their applications. They're moving from monolithic end-tiered architectures to more container-based architectures. This helps drive towards microservices. Well, what does that mean in terms of your software architecture? Well, it now means you can completely abstract the operating system away from the compute itself. Using containers and something like Linux, you can actually take your application, contain it, and move it around, be mobile on any infrastructure. So you're now independent of whether you're on cloud, on-prem, whether you're in a cloud, on a virtualization platform, or whether you're on hardware. So what does this mean for buying? Let's have a quick look. So let's go back to the 80s. If you wanted to buy, and I've taken a proprietary example here, AIX on Power with apps. So if you wanted to buy this solution and you tried to buy it in its part, you couldn't. You had to buy it as an integrated solution. So you had no choice but to negotiate for the complete solution. And you would send out an RFI to the various manufacturers to actually bid on this type of solution. Coming back into the 90s, you had some choice, but it was limited. What was that choice? Well, you could pick Windows as a platform with an x86 undercurrent in terms of infrastructure, or maybe you could pick Linux. But still, you were bidding for a complete integrated stack. There was some choice, but you, in terms of flexibility and commoditization, but you're still buying as a complete integrated solution. So you're going out to vendors for a complete integrated stack. So as we come into the 2000s and beyond, where virtualization takes a stronghold, you now got a choice of hypervisors. So on the left, you'll see I've got VMW for VMware, Red Hat Virtualization, KVM, and various other options in the marketplace. And you would choose whether you wanted to have VMware as your hypervisor, whether you wanted something like Red Hat Virtualization as your hypervisor, or KVM. But still, you were locked into a complete converged solution. Everything integrated together. So you would actually go to your vendors and you look for a converged solution price. And each vendor would make their own bid. But coming back into today, as 3 decades have gone past and you're now into the whole situation of abstracting your application from your compute, containers and Kubernetes really makes a big impact on what you need to actually negotiate for. Before, bidding for a complete stack was necessary, i.e. software layer, hardware layer, the storage underneath. But the reality is today, you're now abstracted away from the hardware. Do you necessarily need to bid the whole converged stack? And when I mean converged, people think converged means, a hardware box with everything put together. But converged can also be in the cloud like Amazon or Google or Azure. Everything integrated together, converged together, ready to go. Is that necessarily the right way to go? Maybe that's what you want in your organization. But if you're really looking to make big impact and you can abstract, or you're looking to abstract your software layer for agility and mobility away from your compute, and you're going to define software-defined computing, then why are you bringing this together? Maybe there's a new way you need to look at buying. So in the last 3 decades, the method of buying from an IT department or from a bid team has been pretty much unchanged. But since the stack has changed and you've been able to abstract away from the compute, the actual application layer from the OS upwards, should you necessarily be asking for RFIs, RFQs on a complete solution? Maybe, maybe not. But what could be the impact if you change the way you looked at buying? Let's have a quick look. So in this diagram here, what you see here is the idea at the top of you're going to go and implement a Kubernetes and container solution. So if that's what you're going to do, then what is it you need to look at in terms of how do you go and get pricing for your infrastructure? And in fact, how do you plan such a rollout with such an agile platform? Well, the first thing is you've really got to look at pure open source tools. One thing that Oracle Linux is pure open source tools. This is important because with pure open source tools, you can actually create an abstraction layer which is totally independent without any proprietary tools locking into a single vendor. If you can do that and actually build an abstraction of software-defined compute without actually locking into a vendor, then you can actually split the procurement of actually the software layer from the compute layer. But what does that do for you? Well, in a converged stack, you're bidding for the whole stack, hardware, storage, networking, and the software. Everything's integrated and you don't know what part of the stack is costing you what. And actually, do you actually even need it? If you're moving down this path of software-defined compute, which is taking an abstraction using Kubernetes, containers, using Ceph, software-defined networks, etc., 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 then do you really need the hardware right now? Because part of the value of the software is that you can actually consolidate what you have. So if you look in the diagram, the first thing you can do is limit yourself to actually not buy everything in one go, because all these converged solutions tend to attract a subscription. And those subscriptions tend to be wrapped around proprietary tools. One of the things you should consider, how long is your project going to take to actually get to production? Could it take 1 year, 2 years? And in those 2 years or 3 years, if you run out of money, if you don't pay the subscription, does your project go dead? Well, certainly another thing that Oracle Linux brings to the table is we don't allow your project to stop because we are pure open source, and if you can't afford to pay the subscriptions that you need to support your projects and you switch off those subscriptions with Oracle Linux, because they're pure open source, you can continue with the project. Your project doesn't stop. But that's just a minor benefit. The bigger benefit is if you really focus on the software stack or the software layer above, and actually you're looking to move to Kubernetes and containers to abstract away from the hardware and have software-defined storage, software-defined networks, software-defined compute, then the first thing you can do is actually establish that as a software layer and actually start to look at maximizing the utilization of the hardware you've got already. Don't go straight into buying a converged solution, whether it's in a cloud or whether it's on-prem in a box. First of all, get your software layer on top established and consolidate what you already have. What you then might find, you only have to buy a smaller amount of compute power from a hardware perspective to fill the gap between what you've utilized and what you actually need to go into production. So the point is don't go straight in a new project where you're moving towards microservices, you're moving towards agility with Kubernetes and containers, and you're moving towards software-defined compute power, meaning network, storage, servers. Don't go in and look to buy everything in one go. Buy the software layer on top first, and then buy the hardware later. Most hardware vendors today are buying new software companies to add value to their hardware, to push you to buy proprietary tools anchored around buying a converged solution. Some of the big blue chip companies today are actually starting by doing this first before they move to public clouds, before they think about buying a converged stack from any vendor. Oracle Linux allows you with open source tools to establish that software-defined compute above the hardware with Kubernetes, with containers. This would be your first step, and you'd find that the budget you need to get these projects off the ground is far, far lower than you ever expected. Up to 60 to 70% lower than expected. And because they're 60 to 70% lower, the cash needed is lower and the payback is in a shorter time. You'll also find that without buying the extra additional compute hardware and by utilizing what's underneath, using that software stack as defined in Oracle Linux, then you would actually be able to get your project off the ground for almost nothing because you already have everything in-house. This is Mickey, it's a Munch and Learn. If you want to learn more about the details behind how to get your, agile platforms or autonomous platforms off the ground, please give us a call. And really, we have some interesting things for you. And the key takeaway here is the purer the tools you have in terms of open source, the more likely you are to be risk-free and have a better TCO and ROI. And that's where Oracle Linux wins. Thanks for your time today, and I hope to speak to you next time in one of my Munch and Learns or 1 Minute Munches. Thank you.